I am pleased to be able to welcome you to this webinar, Hurting, Healing, Whole When Trauma Impacts Religious Leaders. Trauma isn't just something that happens to members of congregations. Trauma is also something that happens to leaders, who are usually the ones who are responsible for helping others through the trauma. And so then we have to ask the question, who is helping the leaders? Pamela Pater Ennis is founder and CEO of Hudson River Care and Counseling in Hoboken, New Jersey. It's a multilingual, multicultural, multi-faith psychotherapy and coaching practice. I can say that. And has also founded My Sanctuary Healing in Teaneck, which is committed to providing counseling, research, and prevention for victims of religious and spiritual abuse. Pam is a graduate of this institution back in 1984, which is amazing because I'm sure Pam is only 29, but somehow graduated 40 years ago, and has a doctorate and has a MSW, I think. Is that the right, found the right degree? Yes. So she has done a lot of work in this area. She's going to share the results of her studies and her insight with us. And then after Pam is done, Faye Taylor, who is assistant professor of spiritual formation and field education here at New Brunswick, is going to give a response to Pam. A lot of Dr. Taylor's work happens in the area of clergy self-care. So she'll be responding to Pam and setting all of us up for some more questions. So after Pam's presentation and Dr. Taylor's response, we will have a time for everybody to respond. At that point, I will invite everybody to use your little electronic hands. You go down, find the reactions button, and there's a raise hand feature. And you can raise your electronic hands, and I will be able to call on you, and you'll be able to share your insights or ask your questions, and we will have conversation. Okay, and so now we begin with Dr. Pam Ennis.
Thank you. I know if you're all here, you know that there's a much needed discussion here around this topic. I work both with victims and with, religious leaders can be victims too, but I also work with lay people who've been victims, I should say. But this part of working with leaders who've been victimizing in a counseling context and through research is a newer piece of what we've been working on here. So we all know the struggle of the church and how the patterns of the church, the changing demographic landscape in North America, and how things have been changing with decline in membership, and how that impacts, of course, upon all of us now who are leaders, right? And then all that, and I'll say more about that in a moment, but of course then COVID really exacerbated all these trends. So really the statistics are alarming and have only become more pronounced, really, like I said, in recent years. This is just a little bit of what's out there. You can see this all in the PowerPoint, and I believe Dr. Brom, you will send this out to the participants, I think, tomorrow, right? To, again, if they would like to see this. According to the Global Center for Religious Research, 27 to 33% of U.S. adults, which is a third, have experienced religious abuse at some point in their lives. And then within that context, 90% of those who responded to that survey knew someone who had suffered from some type of religious trauma. And I think that's true because as I work with individuals and in my groups and in my individual sessions, I find that people always know more people, shared experiences. And then Barna in 2021 said that 30%, which we know is true, again, this is right during COVID, 38% of surveyed full-time religious leaders have considered quitting. And I know I've experienced that just around me, like and I'm our RCA minister, but so many people in our age bracket and younger are retiring or leaving. It's really quite alarming. But not to lose hope, right? And So that's why we're here, to kind of bring about renewed purpose in the long run for our faith leaders. So I just want to take a moment to do some definitions, because there's a lot of definitions in all of this. We hear about spiritual abuse and religious abuse and how those terms get interchanged. And then we hear about adverse religious experience, religious trauma, and then there's something called religious trauma syndrome. They're all in the PowerPoint, but I think the real thing we're talking about here is people who probably experience adverse religious experience. It could be a one-time event, or it could be a series of events. And just like with post-traumatic stress disorder, when people have layers of things happen to them in the church, that becomes more of a syndrome, right? And even in the PTS, if you know psychology in the DSM-5, there's a chronic PTSD and there's an acute PTSD. And I'm talking about people who really suffer chronically, and they're the people I tend to see in my practice. Spiritual abuse, I think, could be anything that's non-religious, but we tend to mix those terms. And I won't spend a lot of time on this just in the name of time, but you guys can look at these yourself, and we can talk about it off camera too if you'd like. I'm gonna flip over to just really talking about religion, then focusing on religious trauma syndrome. So going forward in this presentation, that's really what I'm saying. There's actually a push in psychological circles to make this become an actual bona fide diagnosis. It's not technically a diagnosis yet, except in these arenas where we're doing this research and this clinical work. But there's a push in the next DSM, which I don't know when it's coming out, the DSM-6. The current one, DSM-5 TR, was just out, I believe, in 2022. But there's a push because it's such a chronic issue now in our culture to make this happen. And I dare say, and I haven't seen a lot of studies on this yet, that one reason I think that people have really left the church is because I would dare say those individuals have experienced some form of religious abuse. So now I'm going to focus clearly on religious trauma syndrome and how it's really multi-directional. We all know that some religious leaders have the capacity to abuse their congregants. Um, And then we also know that and this is a newer piece in what we're focusing on today, that some religious leaders have been abused by their congregants. In terms of, and then there's vicarious trauma and direct trauma. Vicarious trauma being what a lot of us feel as leaders, right? What's been called burnout, where we get depressed, we get overwhelmed with the stressors of ministry. We all know it's a hard work, and we're going to talk about how there's poor boundaries and all those things we know about, right? Little pay, a lot of expectations. But the direct trauma is when what we've experienced as leaders, when we have congregants, because of their own frustrations probably, and their own the shrinking dynamics of congregations and their own mental health issues and substance abuse issues and whatever's there, where they attack and criticize. And that's, I think, a lot of what we come up against, and that chronically is going to lead to burnout and just exacerbate the burnout. I have an example. I just want to share that we all have stories, but just quick stories. I have seen leaders be ostracized for many reasons, or even lay people, but in this case, leaders. I have a man in my caseload who's a really vibrant, such a vibrant, talented leader, who's a musician as well as an amazing preacher, and a really gregarious, caring person who was totally ostracized by his community because he was gay. And then really lost his ministry. Then I have another individual who, in the time of COVID in his own denomination, was really ostracized because he was tended to be progressive theologically and socially, and he was in a more conservative community, and he was ostracized and expected to preach on conservative politics, and that led for him to suicidal ideation and a breakdown. Ultimately, he left the church. So both of these individuals had to leave the church and leave their ministry, and now have gone into other professions. One became a nurse and one became a social worker, actually, but we've lost their gifts in the church. We all know the stories of religious leaders who've abused congregants. I've worked with many of those. The clergy we know about who've committed sexual abuse to their congregants and crossed boundaries. But today we're going to talk about the people who have been victimized. And it could be the that I'm talking about big T stuff, but there's that little T stuff too, where people are hurt by just the expectations, like when you're a change agent, for instance, in a congregation, like you're in a demographically changing community, and um, I know of a situation where, and I've been in these situations where you're in a situation where you're in let's say in a old white community, and then the community has changed, and there's a need to plant a Spanish community, a Spanish congregation, and the old white remnant attacks because they're just afraid of the change, and there's that institutionalized racism in the mix there too. So all of that begins to erode people's ministries. As Barna says, going back to the research that Barna did in 2021, we all know this, and you can add to this list. We can probably discuss this later. There's few boundaries. Clergy and religious leaders are expected to have multiple skill sets. Really, skill sets supposed to be real, like be public speakers, be musical, be a mediator, be counselors, be community organizers, be administrators, be business managers, be educators, be good hosts, for low pay, and have very high expectations. That things like, wow, you're going to recreate the 1955 church just as they know it. The people, and I think Dr. Fay is going to probably speak to this a little more too later on, like the people especially at risk and beyond what I'm saying here now, who are persons of color and disabled persons, people, women, in general, LGBT community, and individuals, as I said, who are called to be change agents. These people are particularly at risk for receiving abuse, becoming victims of abuse. So I lay out for you, and this is kind of like a clinical model, which I've been using in my own work, and that I've trained some of my clinicians to do. It's really a 3-stage process with a lot of steps. And I was a little playful with the names here: hurting, healing, whole in parentheses, W in parentheses, because what you're doing is creating wholeness and shalom and peace, ultimately, from the holes. People who have trauma survivors will often describe that they have a hole inside of them that can't be satiated, can't be filled up. They don't feel, they don't even know what their feelings are. They're afraid to even look at their feelings because of fear of falling apart, or because they'll become suicidal. So I'm going to just quickly go through this, not hopefully it doesn't sound too clinical. But it's a plan that we can lay out, and it will help people heal. In the hurting stage, I think clergy leaders or religious leaders start to feel like they are just falling apart, right? They can't concentrate. They're not performing well. They can't get out of bed. Sometimes they start missing worship. They aren't calling on people, and then it starts to leak. And then that's somewhere when they start to reach out to make a call. Get to the right page here. So sometimes that can go on for a couple of months, a year, and finally they hit a point of depression, probably becoming suicidal, and then they finally reach out for a call. They have really high PTSD, which would mean they're depressed, they're anxious, they have hypervigilance, they're aware of everything around them, every noise is heightened, and they actually can become paranoid and believe that people are out to get them. It's particularly true with someone who's probably living in a parsonage next door to a church, and they're sitting over there all hunkered down, and then they can see what's going on next door, and it just exacerbates the paranoia. So at that point, people will reach out for help because they can't go on. They need intervention, both probably with counseling and with medication. Now, finally, the healing is the longest stage, and that's really where we encourage clients to begin to tell his or her stories as many, using a model of narrative therapy where they keep telling their stories as many times as they need to, and even going way back into childhood patterns of faith, just telling it all the way back, and call to ministry, experiences of ministry, the antecedents to the breakdown, and just tell the stories as many times as they need to tell them. And you're looking at looking at their somatic needs, their psychological needs, their relational needs, or even their financial needs and their spiritual domains. Because even, of course, in this moment, at this point in their lives, they start to really lax even on their spiritual disciplines of prayer. I already mentioned that many times they can't preach anymore. They're not reading scripture. They just sort of shut down, and oftentimes are even very angry at God. So part of the work, in addition to all this telling the narratives, is to really begin to help the person do a cost benefit analysis, essentially, like what's best for you. And that's as in the case of these two men I talked about before, the one who had, the two had left ministry, that what's healthier for you emotionally, what's healthier, what's best for you, what is God now calling you to, and to really weigh that over a period of months. Ultimately, then what needs to happen if the person decides to leave, the person's going to have to find new community, and that often is first through a support group or a therapy group where they can develop connections with other leaders or other people who've been victimized by the church. A support group is, as Arina Gallam said, who's a group there, said, like, it's an installation of hope when you realize that other people, ideally what we do in church, right? When other people can begin to give you hope that there is something for the future to look to. And it's developing new ways of relating as the healing goes on. By this point, the person's been in individual counseling. This person's probably been on medication. And part of the work really is forgiveness work. Forgiveness towards God, perhaps, like, God, I'm really angry at you. Forgiveness towards the church people or the denomination, or maybe even a partner or a spouse. Forgiveness certainly towards the abusers. And all of these things take a period of time. And that's moving into eventually accepting, yes, that the abuse happened, but I can go on. It's when the hope starts to come in. Part of the tricky process in all this too is helping people to really, maybe they begin to view their faith differently. What are my theological views now? What are my beliefs in God? There's a lot of talk now about deconstructing God, but it's really just, well, what do I think? As for instance, the classic one would be like someone who's in the LGBT community. They were taught many times that being gay is a sin. But in this work, it's like, how do they integrate all those different identities, being gay and being religious, and coming out on the other side, like an integrated identity to be both a gay Christian, essentially. So a lot of that work is done. It can be done in other arenas too, like even for women, like if you were raised in a very conservative tradition, like women weren't supposed to speak, right? So how do you integrate all of that? So really working through those details. And then sometimes it's either a new ministry, something new has to happen, right? There's got to be a renewed purpose, like leaving probably the congregation you're in, going to a new place. But a lot of times, unfortunately, people leave ministry and usually end up in another helping profession like nursing or social work or psychology. But it's after a very long, drawn out process. Sort of in the midst of all this, as someone's moving sort of this to the wholeness stage, would really be he or she has to begin to probably start to creep forth and re-engage in another faith community. Maybe it's a different denomination. It's certainly a different congregation, even if they now are just I don't say just a lay person, but a lay person if they've left ministry. But to expose to a place, maybe with the work of a pastoral counselor or a spiritual director, like, okay, where can I go and be safe? Maybe not even get involved for a while, but be safe and find just worship, just listen to good music. And that's all part of still exploring what he or she wants to do. And then a real like in AA, the one of the later stages is like when people begin to really think, oh, now I'm going to help people who've also been through what I've been through. That's a sign that they've really healed. And then again, at the end, they're really having hope again. Because when you have hope and really it becomes peace of mind, that's that sense of shalom, right? And wholeness. Um, I just added in, I think Dr. Faye is going to talk a lot about this too, but I'm going to say like some healthy suggestions. We all know these. I mean, I'm speaking to the choir. Here's the saying goes, but we as clergy need spiritual direction. We need psychotherapy with someone who has a faith background, or if we have been a victim of abuse, we certainly need psychotherapy with a religious trauma specialist. Maybe again, a group is vital to be in a support group or therapy group around these issues because you have to re-engage in community before you can re-engage in a new church. You probably need a nutritionist, regular exercise, renewed spiritual practice, perhaps a sabbatical. And in more severe cases, people need to take FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act, or in some cases even go on short-term disability to leave work altogether and heal. I added a references, and I'm just going to stop there. And I know there's so much more we could say, but I would really love to hear your feedback. So James, I pass it to you.
And Dr. Taylor is going to get first crack. So go
Yes,
ahead.
Dr. Taylor,
Go
go
ahead,
ahead.
Faye.
Thank you and good afternoon. Thank you, Pam, for that thorough presentation.
There's so much more, but this is a survey course.
But my response will focus on the need for measures to assist in the healing process. Having been a pastor for 20 years, I am acquainted with leadership trauma. As has been presented, leaders experience trauma in a variety of ways. Although much of what is written about religious trauma focuses on the congregant experience of some kind of abuse by a religious leader, relatively little is found on religious leaders' trauma outside of catastrophic events. The pandemic necessitated a look at the effects of trauma of leaders, of congregations, and ministries. However, it also opened the possibility to explore trauma of other kinds. Clearly, COVID placed an enormous stress on clergy leaders. The large loss of lives and the expectation of clergy to have answers caused unprecedented stress. The effects are still being felt post-pandemic. Yet the trauma religious leaders face even now very often is due to many things. There may be conflicts with congregants and the leader in the church. As the leader is a visionary, organized opposition to the vision contributes to stress levels. Personality differences between the leadership and the membership causes stress. Trauma and stress also stem from religious leaders being first responders, quote unquote. Of course, we think of first responders as those who are the first on the scene when tragedy occurs. Those recognized first responders are usually firefighters, emergency medical technicians, and police officers. They come with their own issues of trauma, of course, but I suggest that religious leaders also be thought of as first responders. When tragedy strikes in a congregant or ministry family, one of the first calls is usually to the pastor or leader who responds by being present in the situation. Managing grief and navigating loss for congregants and ministry members elevate stress levels. The issue becomes, where does the religious leader go to relieve the stress and address the trauma? Pamela provided resources for the healing process, and I suggest that measures are important to prevent burnout and stress and trauma. Roy Oswald, in Clergy Self-Care, Finding Balance for Effective Ministry, a publication of the Alban Institute, explains that with no encouragement or support in self-care, clergy are often left to twist in the wind. Religious leaders must manage the tension between their call from God, which is viewed as a commitment to the highest ideals, and finding nurturing ways to sustain themselves. Healthy practices up front can make the difference in how religious leaders handle stress and trauma when they arise. Oswald suggests finding time for self on a daily, weekly, quarterly, and yearly basis may be a way to find rhythms of rest and manage stress. Getting control of time factors in managing stress and trauma. Be realistic about how much can be accomplished. Unrealistic self-expectations not met lead to guilt and feelings of being unworthy. Setting limits and boundaries for self and others can achieve a life balance. Establish trade-offs, and I like trade-offs. What can be taken on today for something less important that may be picked up next week? Have the hard conversations with those that you are in conflict with. Not having the conversations contributes to both physical and mental health stress. Be aware of what has been called compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue is an evolving concept in the field of traumatology. The term has been used interchangeably with secondary traumatic stress, which is sometimes simply described as the negative cost of caring. Compassionate fatigue is a form of psychological stress that arises from the emotional and physical demands of caring for and about others, particularly in high-stress environments like healthcare settings. It can manifest as a combination of physical, emotional, and behavioral symptoms, including feelings of exhaustion, irritability, apathy, and a reduced ability to empathize with patients or with colleagues. Left unaddressed, compassion fatigue can lead to burnout, decreased job satisfaction, and compromised care for the ones you are caring for. I suggest that compassion fatigue exists among religious leaders as well. The enormous amount of energy involved in shepherding congregants through life experiences takes a toll on religious leaders. As they pour out from their emotional well, it takes a toll if there is no refilling of that well. It is not that religious leaders care too much, but that caring may overwhelm their emotional capacity. When that happens, a shutdown occurs, a numbing, if you will. When it is apparent that compassion fatigue is a factor in performance, proactive measures are necessary. Adjudicatories may provide programs that monitor and support well-being, periodically checking to determine the mental and emotional state of its leaders. Neglect of preventive health care may impact the ability to manage stress and trauma, and this is simply extremely important. And simply put, schedule regular medical checkups. Keep on top of known conditions. Follow medical advice. Be intentional about scheduling time with family and friends. Join or establish a support network of trusted associates. Join or establish a group that has nothing to do with the ministry solely to have you play and have fun. And let me say, therapy is not a bad word. The stigma surrounding therapy for religious leaders hampers receiving needed help. Do research and select a therapist that meets the needs. Engage a spiritual director, as Pam mentioned, who listens and helps to locate God in whatever the situation may be. And now this is extremely important. Establish a Sabbath, a time spent in God's presence, practicing spiritual stillness for renewal and restoration. Kirk Byron Jones in Rest in the Storm, Self-Care Strategies for Clergy and Other Caregivers suggest claim your calm. Claim your calm. One personal thing that assists in claiming your calm is spending time writing in a journal. I believe in journaling. The act of sitting and writing helps put thoughts and feelings into perspective. Journaling pairs the analytical portion of the brain with the creative side, which often prompts a new way of looking at a situation that has caused trauma. It can be the benefit, it can be the biggest benefit when it comes to stress. Simply taking the time to sit and write about anything makes a difference. When writing openly and honestly, it is a true expression of one's inner self. This is an essential practice for self-care, often reducing stress and anxiety, increasing motivation, and improving goal-setting skills. According to the Schaefer Institute, 70% of pastors constantly fight depression. 71% are burned out. 80% believe that pastoral ministry has negatively affected their families. 70% do not even have one close friend, often surrounded by people, yet living in loneliness. 80% will leave the ministry within 5 years of graduating from seminary. And this is a startling statistic. Between 1,000 and 1,500 pastors leave the ministry permanently each month. That's each month. Less than 1 in 10 that began as pastors will retire as pastors. This is startling data. It is my belief that God has not called us to sacrifice self for the work of God's kingdom. The sacrificial work has already been accomplished. So I suggest spending time revisiting Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 and 29, and read it as if it's a direct message to self. The work is indeed all divine. However, the people worked with are not necessarily divine. Religious leaders bring their whole selves to ministry. Establishing ways to preserve self and fulfill calling is possible. Healthy religious leaders are able to remain in ministry and navigate the tough times as they avail themselves of practices that can sustain them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Thank you, Dr. Peter Ennis. We come to our time when we start sharing. Dr. Taylor, don't go away and hide. You get to answer questions too. But we come to our time when we start sharing our own thoughts and questions together. There was something dropped in the Q&A from Nick Bass. What about the stage where the leader is in their new call or role and runs into PTSD triggers? Where I am in that narrative feels like a different stage in that story.
Do you want me to try to get that one, or you want to do that one, Faye? You're muted.
No,
You can
Pam,
both
go
try.
right ahead.
Okay. I think you're okay. So someone's new in ministry and they're having triggers. I think at that point, it would be, I mean, if again, like someone put in the chat that a lot of clergy don't like to be vulnerable. We're kind of raised to be always like, at least I was always to be strong, got to keep it together. And so I think hopefully that someone or that person will get into some treatment. But in the meantime, picking up on Dr. Taylor's suggestion, like maybe before therapy comes, if you're not ready yet, to start journaling and maybe just to figure out like what are the antecedents, like what's going on, my thoughts, my feelings, my body, what's going in my body just before I'm having episodes of PTSD or triggers. Because that's what a therapist is going to ask you too, like where is this coming from, what's the context, and also to look at like past experiences, what might be informing the current experience.
And I think too what you said, Pam, about being realistic about whether this ministry is something that is for you to do. We sometimes we think that ministry is only defined if we are pastors, if we are a part of a congregation, a parish ministry. But there's so many other ways to do ministry and to be in ministry. And that if something is going to be detrimental to your mental health or your physical health, then think about and seek God about what other way can I actualize this ministry that you've called me to.
Yes, I think so. And that's part of the hard part, because for people who've been called to ministry, gone through the whole training, seminary, first calls, maybe it's early in their career. I think nowadays it tends to be within that 5-year mark, but I've been but you're dealing with people who've been in ministry 20, 30 years, and that's even harder because that's all that person has known. Perhaps they've even grown up in ministry. Maybe there's generations of clergy in their family. It's so hard for people to let go of that. So, but it takes a lot of in-depth work to even understand that dynamic too. What are you hanging on to? Why are you hanging on to it? What else could you do that God's calling you to? And again, how maybe you have to rethink how you view God in your life. Maybe your theology shifts a little bit. It's complicated. It's very complex. Not done easily or quickly. Yeah.
And I apologize for any mispronunciations in advance, but Karen Kellawam, would you go ahead and unmute and yes, join in?
Hi, good day. I'm a student of New Brunswick as well. And my question really lies within the concept of church generational trauma, which is something that flows where possibly a trauma that occurred in one generation floats into the youth or the younger generation just simply by secondhand information and from vicarious learning. And that is something that hasn't really been touched on quite a lot because we're talking about existing traumas, but there are traumas that are going back generations within the church.
That's actually a really insightful question. I guess we'd kind of put that, broadly speaking, in that vicarious trauma category, but I think that's an excellent point. And we know as when we do counseling, psychotherapists, we dig into generations and family systems. Well, you're right to look into church systems too. And some of the work that I don't know, I mean, I do, and I'm sure Dr. Taylor does too, is just to work with congregations that have been traumatized. So there's that. And then, but I think what you're talking about, Kieran, is families who've had trauma, and you really do have to dig in and understand how they make meaning out of that, you know. So it's really, in some ways, not like undoing any other trauma, whether it's sexual trauma or addiction, but it's more complicated, obviously, if it's connected to church. Yeah. But definitely, that's a really, really insightful question. I'd love to talk to you more about that, what that means for you.
So I don't mind explaining where I'm coming from, because I what you would call, I would fit within the Black and brown community. And in the instance, there are some learned behaviors and learned traumas that have erupted in those communities over the years. So one of those things might sound funny, but it's in our names. So a lot of the names of particular individuals I'm probably one of the few who still have my last name attached to my family name. But because of the church, the trauma of the history has erupted that historical name. And that's just one thing. But then the church's story has sometimes told us we cannot express ourselves in a particular way or cannot do something. And that learned behavior is from a trauma-based backing. And I think that's where I'm coming from, because sometimes it's not just one generation back, it's a few generations back.
And I think it's church trauma in that sense isn't unlike family trauma, where then in church trauma, if there's a church family, it gets all intertwined, right? But when there's trauma, people are taught to not speak.
Correct.
And so I think that's what you're talking about. And be strong. It's all tied in with that vulnerability or not being vulnerable thing too. But the shame and inciting with shame. So it takes a lot to undo that. I had a case one time years ago, just as an example of that, where a pastor had significantly sexually abused a bunch of adolescents, and the young woman came to me. I think she was 16 years old at the time, and even it was so much shaming in that church community and even in the family who were leaders in the church, the lay leaders, that they didn't want me to report it. But of course, I had to report it because I was a mandated reporter. But it's very complex. That's probably the most blatant case I've seen of that, where not wanting to talk about really happened. But you're right, and maybe offline we can talk more because it's a very complicated issue.
Mm.
And we have to do a lot of education about that. It's okay to come forward. It's okay to talk about this stuff. The only talking about it, that's why I talk about narratives. It's the only way the healing is going to happen.
Mhm. I think too, Pam, one of the other factors may be culture is a factor. And
Well,
we
yes, thank you. I thought I'd leave that for you as a Black and brown
culture is
person.
also a factor. There's some things that are culturally considered taboo or it's culturally
Yes.
considered okay. And so you have to factor in the culture too when you're talking about that kind of a generational trauma that he has talked about there. And so
Just like in families, and you also were looking at different levels of different styles of leadership too, like
right.
authoritarian, non-authoritarian, hierarchical, it's all in the mix. And it's in an Asian church from an African American church and a Spanish church. Yeah, it's, but not unlike what we do if we work with people, families from different cultures. It's really being culturally humble to understand what's being brought into the. But I let you handle that part because it's a very complex issue.
You're muted, James.
Sorry, Susan Heisinger, go ahead and share.
Okay, hi there. So I'm an NBTS graduate of 1990, and I'm still in ministry, 35 years in. I'm in 25 years as a chaplain. And so what I had written in the chat was that I had some pretty difficult experiences in different churches, and I also observed a lot of different congregations. And when I went to SUNY Upstate in Syracuse as a chaplain, I started working very, very part-time for a church, a Reformed church. And they seemed nice, but I just realized like I was just waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was thinking, oh, they're being nice to me now, but sooner or later they're going to be really mean and like normal, right? But then I realized that they were a church that was in the habit of treating their pastor really well and giving the pastor the benefit of the doubt. And talking about culture, I realized that there are churches that are really in a habit, a tradition of being kinder, gentler. Some of them are clergy killers. I mean, some of them they just do it time after time and again. But what I was interested in was how I didn't even realize how wounded I was by the church until I got to that place, and the people there were so supportive. And then when the pandemic hit, I ended up having to give them a lot more guidance than I really signed up for. But I was fine with it because we had a relationship, and it was very healing for me. So I just wanted to share that.
We'd like to
Thank
think that that's the norm,
Oh, no, it's not.
but it's not. We'd like to think that that's because people bring themselves with them to parishes. They bring themselves and everything that's with them. And sometimes it is
it's exacerbated in that context.
exacerbate. Absolutely. And as Pam was talking about family systems, that's that little what happens in churches. You can kind of figure out who people are by their behaviors, what sibling position they're in. And how they have been accepted and the things that they've had to deal with. But I'm glad that they were a congregation that emulates the teachings of Jesus.
You were in, I'm so glad it was a healing context for you.
Yes, absolutely.
Because I think and sometimes that's tricky part about this. You don't even know you're in crisis, as you're saying, right, Susan, if I heard you correctly, until
Right.
you get into a healthier place, you go, whew, wow, and you can start to heal, right? But you got to be safe to heal.
Yeah, be safe to heal.
Exactly. And what was really interesting for you Reformed Church people is one day I was in the office and I looked on the wall and there's a indication that Bob White once pastored that church, who was the president of New Brunswick later on, and also a couple other New Brunswick grads. And I was living in the parsonage that was built in 1972 for Jim Neville, who was when I was in my first church. And I happened to get a phone call from him because somebody in their community in Michigan, where they were living, had a relative in upstate who was a patient and had nobody. So he asked me to visit her. It was like the connections in this place were like beyond belief.
Yeah, it happens in all those little towns.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Hudson Valley there.
We have a question that was left in the chat to be asked anonymously. How should clergy address situations where church leadership exhibits bullying behavior, such as collectively opposing the minister during disagreements?
Mm-hmm.
What strategies can help manage these dynamics while maintaining personal well-being and professional integrity?
Yeah. I think, and I guess we both can respond to this, Faye, right? But I think it's depending on the denominational structure, would be to go to your judicatory, get some help, some intervention. I would think it would also probably mean some kind of mediation process. And then I would say alongside of that the pastor who's being attacked probably needs to engage in his or her own therapy with the pastor, with a therapist who is also probably trained, maybe duly trained, much like Faye and I are, like as a minister and someone who has a counseling background, because the pastor's going to need support, but then the church needs an intervention too. It's got to be like sort of both and.
Absolutely. I think you're right, Pamela. Having someone to come in to mediate what's going on is important, I think, but it's also important not only for the pastor who needs that support, but for the congregation to understand the part they're playing in this. And that doesn't often happen. The congregation is seen as, they're the body that employs the pastor. And so they have decisions that they can make that give them power. And so there's a power dynamic going on. And so to be able to have someone come in from the external, from the outside to help mediate that and to help navigate that for both the congregants and the pastor, I think is extremely important. I mean, I have a pastor now that I oversee that's having that very same thing. The congregation, that there's a group, a faction in the congregation that decides they will want to be the pastor instead of the pastor. And it has caused great stress on the pastor. But he's managed it because he's doing some self-care things that will help him. But the issue is making sure that the congregation knows that their behavior is inappropriate as well.
Right, it's got to be both and.
That'll be both and.
Again, from Nick Boss. If the stats are this bad for minister retention and degrees of trauma, what is being done to make churches healthier? It seems we are doing the witness of Christ a great harm, but I do not see large movement for creating healthier churches. The church will continue to bleed members and leaders without addressing the systemic problem.
Well,
Yeah.
I've been often told that healthy pastors make healthy churches, or as the pastor is, so the church goes. Now, may or may not be so, but um, I do believe that the healthier the pastor is, the more self-confident and self-aware that the pastor is. The more focused the pastor is on um, making sure that the congregants are getting what they need in terms of teachings and preachings. Um, that over time, um, the hope is that the congregants will also benefit from that. I know that's not always the case, but I think that if we if it's if as clergy leaders we exhibit healthy practices and we instill healthy practices for our congregants, then I think we might begin to see some changes happening.
Although I think it's also gotta be whatever, I don't know what, it's no easy answer, but there's gotta be a lot of work from our denominations to work with congregations though
Yeah.
too. 'Cause it's
Mhm.
again, it's a systemic. And I think if that's what you're saying, Nick, like, otherwise it just becomes victim blaming, because a person can be pretty healthy and then if they're really attacked over a period of time, it's gonna wear you down. Although if someone comes in with trauma, it's just gonna exacerbate, right?
Exacerbated, right?
I mean, and if you're dealing with congregations and as a person, as we've served really pretty urban congregations in our ministry, if you're dealing with people where there's congregations where they're already in demographically changing communities and they're already struggling, and you're dealing with a lot of mentally ill people and so on and so forth, you're already dealing with deficits in the sense that
Mhm.
it's a beautiful ministry, but you're not dealing with a lot of strength. So there's a lot that has to be done, right? All on both sides. Again, I can't stress that enough. That it can't be just the minister, it can't be just the church. It's got to be together.
Yeah,
And I don't know what the easy answer is. Maybe James, we have to do some more training on the seminary level, even, and more counseling. I don't know what it means. I mean,
Mhm.
we have to beef up our EAP programs. I don't know.
So I think you're right. We have to probably prepare new folks a
Talk
little bit
about this theological.
better to talk about it and how to manage it. Yeah, exactly.
Um, well, Susan Heisinger pointed out in the chat that Albany Synod is doing the faith walking program that's intended to help churches be healthier in the
Okay.
first place. And I think they've had some good success with that. I will, in the less positive sense, but it was a long time ago now. I will speak to having been part of a group that was working on, helping churches change, helping change the culture of churches and move things forward so that churches could be healthier in their outreach and in their welcoming. And this was, now I'll admit, this was close to 30 years ago. And as I was part of this and attending a seminar, and we'd all done some reading in preparation for this, where the person who'd written this book pointed out that the first pastor who goes in and tries to change the culture of that church is going to get absolutely creamed and attacked and beaten up on. And it's going to be the second pastor who comes in doing the same thing that they're going to start to respond to. And so the denominations had to have something ready to take care of that first wave of pastors and what they were going to do. And I asked the person from the RCA staff who was leading the discussion, okay, what do we do about this part of, about this part? And I was told, well, we had a meeting in staff and we decided that that wasn't going to happen in the RCA. So we'd be okay.
Okay.
I don't think it worked out that way.
Mm.
But LL DeBrill, would you go ahead and share?
Yeah, I have been working until my retirement as an intentional interim. And we all know there's a shortage of interim ministers, so they tend to just find that recently retired or, that part-timer and just plug them in. But I think we need to be more intentional in our use of interims. And James, as you just pointed out, that first pastor who comes in and tries to change the culture, it's really neat if you've got a 2-year limit and they know you're leaving. So I go into a traumatized church and I realize that they haven't visited the traumas of the past and they don't want to. But we do. We do listening sessions and we learn to listen and we learn to deal with difficult personalities. And then the joy is you leave. So if you've stirred up a hornet's nest, they know that you're going to be going. But they can't, if you've done your work well, they can't go back to the way they've always done things. You've already stirred it up and raised the hoary head of the trauma that they've been trying to suppress. And I submit that churches who systemically bully and go after their pastors have something deep that needs to be brought out. And we need a real class of intentional interim pastors to go into these situations. And then it's up to the adjudicatory body to put them where they are best used. And I think that might be one of the answers we're seeking if we only had more well-trained people.
And mediators as well before the interim part happens.
Mhm.
Someone asked in here something about what judicatory, what's that class is about, we'll make it enlarge it and say what judicatories can do, I think. And I can't speak for other denominations, but I know in the RCA that some classes, including I know the one I'm a part of in North Jersey, is developed intentional models. We do have some trained mediators, and I know New York Synod does as well. So, I mean, I think there are models out there that are trying to make changes, but I guess.
Oh, you're jumping ahead a little,
Oh,
Dr. Peter
sorry.
Dennis, because I was just about to call on that person.
I'm
and
taking
let-
you on your role, but I was just kind of, there was a segue, but go ahead, James. I apologize.
Okay. Francis Nelson, would you jump on in?
Wait, okay, unmuted. I was just curious what the role of classes is in the actual, that's what my question was, in the things that are going on that you're talking about. I'm part of city classes and we have just recently established a minister care team. Everyone else may have been doing this for years, but we're a fairly new classes. And it is trying to intentionally ahead of time get ahead of some of these things to address things that are happening before it bubbles up to explode. And I was just wondering if there is a system in place. Are these churches as on their own as it sounds like what you are describing? Do they feel they're isolated? Is there some place they can go? Churches, people in the churches, but mostly the ministers. As a minister, that's what I care about. As a therapist, that's what I care about. Ministers themselves.
Wait, what is your specific question though, Francis?
My question is, are the churches as alone in dealing with these things? Are the ministers as
Okay.
alone? It sounds like the battle is between us and them. And I'm just wondering how the accountability of the classes helps.
Well,
in
I
this
think it's
situation.
variable, and again, I can't speak beyond the RCA, but I think it's variable even within any denomination. It's going to be dependent on the local judicatory. I think there's some real intentional models out there, like the Albany Synod. I know Greater Palisades classes where I live happens to have, and New York Synod. I think Liz is on here. She could probably speak to that, where we do. There are models in place. I think it depends where you are. But there are certainly resources that you could look to where the judicatory is involved, where the classes is involved.
I'm wondering if there's something there before it comes to the adjudicatory place. I realize classes and regional synods are adjudicatory bodies, but I'm just wondering, is there some place where help comes in before things are flayed to death? not at the not as a official challenge or an official come in and change things.
Think so. I think it would be just a more informal intervention, like coming to do a mediation. It wouldn't have to be like a supersession or anything.
Okay, that's what I was.
You're asking. I'm not talking about like a supersession. I'm talking about just going in and having conversations intentionally and trying to just to assess and then intervene and see how to make changes.
Do these happen?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't know if you want to speak to the AMEs or other traditions, Faye, but
Unfortunately, we don't necessarily have anything in place like that for our clergy leaders. If it happens on a very individualized basis, but there's no overall system in place to address this, which is part of our problem. And because in our system, it's an Episcopal system, and so clergy persons are appointed to congregations, and so they go where they're sent, and and if it's not a good match, it ends up being a problem. And but there and we don't have anything in place that brings support to that person who finds himself or herself in a position where it's just not working well. And I think that's important. And it needs to happen sooner rather than later in the process of being assigned to a church. But that's one of the things that we need to work on as a denomination ourselves, because our clergy really don't have support.
yeah, stuff.
Okay. Jake Marvel, would you go ahead and unmute and share?
Yeah. This is more of a comment, I guess, not as much of a question. I'm a former military chaplain. I'm a hospital chaplain. And I would identify myself as kind of on the healing side of this trauma journey, with some struggles I've had. And I'm really grateful for the support that I've gotten. I'm just recognizing that the help that I have received that's been most helpful really are not from colleagues in ministry, other professionals that I made the effort to connect with. I guess I just want to kind of lift up kind of the loneliness of this journey, that maybe it's, Pam, you talked about kind of reorienting our support systems. There might be some of that is what's happening, but it's an incredibly, it can be shaming, and it's a very lonely journey to go through this. So thanks for raising the issue, and thanks for making this, a topic that we're talking about. I look forward to how that can change in the future, I hope.
Maybe we need much more of these discussions, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
My own observation is that, Pam talked about the work within RCA classes being kind of variable. And my own observation over years of ministry is that, in almost every classis, there are some ministers and some churches who intentionally stay connected.
Mhm.
And there are some ministers who intentionally don't. And that the ministers who, and staying connected is often, in the classes where I currently serve, we have peer groups that get together. They get together several times a year. One classes I was in, we had a group who got together over sack lunches and would talk about a book, though really most of the time we spent talking about what's going on in church and then got around to the book. So that there were different kinds of conversations, but that the people who stayed connected when the rough water came, it was
Mhm.
much easier to plug in with them
Mhm.
and easier to help them and easier for them to ask for help. And that also included the congregations that stayed connected
Mhm.
than it was for the ones who were off on their own. Heather Kramer, would you go ahead and unmute?
Yeah, so my first call, when I was going to seminary, I was in a very healthy church that supported me, and my first call was really eye-opening. I did not know um, how toxic a place could be. And there was so much shame involved because I hadn't done it before. So I thought I was failing, and it took me a really long time to say anything because I thought it was all me. Um,
Mm.
I have learned now, I'm at a second church, and what Sharon had said made a lot of sense. And now I'm in a kind church, but it feels like being adopted into a family that wants me rather than being in an abusive foster care program.
Wow.
And it took me about a year not to flinch when people were being really kind.
Or to trust it, I imagine.
Trust it.
Yeah.
The trust
Um,
behind it.
so I think I don't know if it would help anybody else, but at the seminary level, I really didn't know what the interviewing process was like. This is a second career for me, and working in a lab is nothing like applying for a church. Um, I
Mhm.
didn't know the right questions to ask. I didn't really know I was getting into a really conservative church. Um, and maybe some guidance in at the seminary level of what to look for. I I don't know. Um, and the previous church that was so hard, I think there are only 3 installed pastors in that classis. And so I think they probably could have done more if my level of shame wasn't so great. So I don't know. There's not really a question. It's just these are observations, I guess.
I think what you raise up, Heather, is the importance of working on a post-trauma. There's a lot of healing that has to happen. Like working on reducing shame and triggers and
Faith walking was incredible for that.
yeah, wow.
Um, well, as a part of what I do here at the seminary, it has to do with career services, and we try to bring informative seminars to our students and to our graduates that do address some of those issues. How do you interview? How do you how do you navigate compensation? How do you what are the right questions that the candidate needs to ask about the church itself? And so in that way, we do try to address those things, but there are periodic seminars that we do that are available to address those issues. But I think you're right. We need more pointed, focused uh, um, coursework on that questions.
That would have been great.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't go to the, sorry, James, I didn't go to the right seminary.
Heather, you're here now. We welcome you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. I know my own observation, and learning over time. First of all, yeah, it's easier after the first church when you have some more experience and you realize that everything is not necessarily you. Um, and I don't know, and I'm not sure there's a whole lot beyond. I mean, we can talk about that in classes, but experience is a much different teacher and a much more helpful one. I know I encourage new ministers more and more to make sure they have something in their life that's outside of their parish.
Yeah.
Because, someplace else where they can have a better sense of validation and also, of okay, here's something you're not good at. Be aware. But I mean, I was fortunate in my first church to have had a wonderful elder who had been there forever and ever and ever, and who would from time to time take me aside and tell me, Jesus came to earth and started a congregation, and everybody wasn't happy with him. And if he couldn't make everybody happy with him, why do you think you have a shot? Just get over it.
Mhm.
And it was a helpful thing. Dr. Prophet Hood, go ahead and unmute and share, please.
This has been very helpful. One of the things that I discovered is shattered expectations. We go into the churches expecting to do great things, but not knowing how wise and how skilled the congregation is at spotting your weaknesses and exploiting you for their goodness. And I think that I agree with someone who mentioned it, that we need courses on the reality of pastoring. We come in there with the glasses, with the glasses on and gun ho, we're going to go in and do much work, and we go in and get beat down. And sometimes we don't tell them the reality that these people have been doing this for a very long time. They are very skilled at how to manipulate, abuse, and traumatize their new pastors into submission. And so, what helped me was I found great counsel from Rocky. All of the Rocky movies, anytime a congregation after 38 years of preaching, I would always remember something that Rocky said. It's not about how hard you can hit back, but it's about how hard you can get hit and still keep moving forward. It's about the heart of the pastor, and we have to have that heart regardless of how hard we get hit and how hard we, get abused and traumatized. We do have to practice self-care. But I think on the seminary level and on colleague level, we need to have those people that we can go to that will have the salve, that will have the balm and say, listen, this too shall pass and move forward. So I think on a seminary level, we really do need to have the reality of pastoring, and what to really expect when you go there. So I appreciate this this forum because it does bring back pleasantly unpleasant memories. But it makes you great. I mean, we have a saying, my grandmother has one, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Sometimes you wish you had died, but you didn't. So get up and keep moving forward.
Dr. Pater Ennis, Dr. Taylor.
Yes.
Just wondered if you wanted to respond.
Yeah, thinking about that, it's almost like I'm taking it all in. Like, I guess there's some truth in that, but I hate to think that I guess my mind is going like, and I agree with you all of that, and I think we've all survived. I guess we wouldn't be here, but I don't know that, like, something you said before, Dr. Taylor, like, do we all have to suffer that much? You know, that's, I'm paraphrasing what you said, but like, we shouldn't have to suffer. I mean, I think suffer, yes, but not at the point of having trauma, not having PTSD, or not having to have major things that impact upon our physical health or mental health. I think that's, there's a line, right? We can suffer, but then when is enough enough, right? So.
When is enough enough? And when do we make a decision that we are valuable and our health is valuable, our mental health is valuable, our physical health is valuable, and we have to take care of self. Again, I don't believe that God would have us sacrifice self to do God's bidding in the world.
Mhm.
Susan Heisinger is going to get the honor of being the last person called on. So, Susan, go ahead and unmute.
Okay, thank you. I'm a slow learner because when Hillary Clinton did not get elected, I remember the next morning, it was like all these scales fell from my eyes, and it was like all these years, it hasn't been about me personally, it's been that I'm a woman.
Yeah.
And to respond to the thing about seminary is I can remember different times in my seminary and church, you know, field education, that people gave me hints of what was to come. And I didn't pick up on them. I heard them and I thought about it and I thought, yeah, but that's because you're doing it wrong. But, you know, I was 26 when I was ordained, so that's really young. And sometimes I just think our denomination, our churches, they need to definitely deal with this issue of trauma and building healthier congregations. But I think, you know, maybe having realistic expectations and knowing that it's not all about theology, you know, that these people are in families that have their dysfunction, and, you know, life is hard, and you're not, you know, I came up with a new motto for myself, which is, I'm not the world's babysitter. And if I am, the pay is terrible and the working conditions aren't that great.
Wow.
But thank you so much for raising this issue. I appreciate it.
Right. I like that.
I like that. I'm gonna take, can I steal your line?
Yeah,
You can have it.
I like that.
Susan, I have a feeling you're soon going to see that all over the place.
Sounds like I hear like article titles, you know.
Uh-huh. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Peter Ennis. Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Thank you, everybody who's been participating in the discussion for a great conversation. I hope everyone has a blessed Advent and a joyous Christmas, and I look forward to seeing you in the new year. Take care, everyone.